An early review of this book says, and I quote, "Above all, Now in November is extraordinary because of its almost clairvoyant insight, its ripe understanding of things, places, and people, its unaffected sensitivity to the minutiae as well as to the major issues of life. It is astonishing that a girl in her early 20s should have composed a work which has such unpretentious but unmistakable power. It has, and how many books of this generation can even suggest it, wisdom." Hey BookTube, it's Kim at Middle of the Book March, and this video is my review of the book Now in November by Josephine Johnson. I read this with Kelly from Books I'm Not Reading, and it was a reread for both of us. Kelly read it many years ago, and I read it, I don't remember, last year or the year before. It has since become one of my favorite books of all time. It's a very short, slim novel, but I wanted to give you a review. First of all, a little background on Josephine Johnson. This book was first published in 1934. It won the Pulitzer in 1935. Josephine Johnson was 24 when this book won the Pulitzer, or when it was published, and it's a debut novel. So it's so extraordinary that a 24-year-old wrote this caliber of a novel, which went on to win the Pulitzer Prize. The biggest disappointment is that Josephine Johnson's career did not really take off. She was more of a social and political activist than a novelist, and she did write other works. There was a very long gap of time when she was most interested in political and cultural activism, which I mentioned, and she did go on to write other works, but they were just not as poetic and beautiful as this novel. She does have several other books. She was also writing poetry and short stories. And a book that I do want to pick up and read is called The Inland Island, which was published in 1969. So, that was 34 years later. So she was in her late 50s once that book was published. So I would love to give a review of Now in November. I'm going to try not to be too wordy or long-winded because I tend to do that with reviews, but because this is a short book and I have read it a couple of times, hopefully I can be articulate and tell you exactly why I love this book so much. What I wanted to start off doing was read the first page and then a little bit of the end. It doesn't spoil the novel at all, but the book starts off like this. Now in November, I can see our years as a whole. This autumn is like both an end and a beginning to our lives, and those days which seemed confused with the blur of all things too near and too familiar are clear and strange now. So I'm gonna go all the way to almost the end of the book. This is the second to last chapter of the book, and this is how one sentence or two, how it ends. It is November, and the year dying fast in the storms. The sycamores wrenched of leaves and the ground gold, the plowed fields scarred around us on the hills. So the beginning of the book begins in November, and it ends in November 10 years later. The book is narrated by the middle daughter of three daughters, Margaret, and she is 14 at the beginning of the book. So it is somewhat of a coming-of-age story, but that is not the primary storyline in the novel. It is the story of the Haldmarn family. It is Merle, who is 10 at the beginning of the book, Margaret, who is 14, and Karen, who is 15, I believe. So three daughters, and their father is let go from his job in a logging industry in the north of the country, right during or immediately after the Great Depression. So he decides to take his family and to a farm that's been in his family for many, many years to try their luck at farming and self-sustaining living. But they really don't have any experience in farming and in working the land. And it's also not only the Great Depression, but the Dust Bowl is happening in the South. So he ends up, and it's kind of interesting. We can assume where he takes his family, but I don't think we ever really know what state he ends up in. So they end up on Haldmarn land that has been in his family but hasn't been resided in or worked for many, many years. So they kind of end up here, and the mother goes along with what the father is trying to do, and she's a very strong, quiet woman, but her daughters look to her to gauge her emotional reactions to the things that their father is deciding to do. So Karen is the oldest, and she is passionate and flighty and opinionated and stubborn. And their father resents her for that. He kind of looks at her as an uncontrollable girl. And this is the 30s, so girls are supposed to be submissive, quiet, agreeable, pretty to look at, and they're supposed to help take care of the home. But Karen wants to do more than cook and clean and bake. She wants to be involved in helping her father work the land and in cleaning up and in doing the things that are necessary to do on a farm. Margaret is the middle child, and she is bookish and quiet, and she does help her mother with the cooking and the cleaning and actually becomes very good at that. And Merle is the youngest. Merle is, she's not only agreeable, but she is happy and optimistic, helpful, glowing of a girl. And she's always trying to look on the best side of everything, no matter what happens on the farm or on the land. That is most likely a disaster for this family, for this farm. And so we kind of read the interactions of all the girls, and Margaret is our narrator, and we can see how she sees her sisters, how she sees her parents. And the book never made me feel like she was telling us everything. Johnson is such a beautiful writer that her description of the family, her description of the land and the landscape, her description of the fauna and the flora in this environment is so superb. It becomes its own character. The way she writes nature and the way she describes the land becomes the 50% of the book is that description. It never made me feel like I'm being lectured to. It made me feel like I could open any page and read any passage, and I felt the dryness. I felt the sun and the heat. I felt the desolation of this land during the Dust Bowl. I felt the depression, and I felt the emotions of each of these members of this family. The farms are spread out so that they do have neighbors. They do know the residents of other farms, but it's not like you can walk down the street and have a neighbor to help you. It's not a neighborhood. It was backbreaking work and a backbreaking existence. When a person did appear on their land or did appear on their farm, it was an event. It was a major event, and there were great interactions and there were scary ones. But the thing that is most striking about the book is the level of isolation that the family endured and the level of back-breaking labor that the family had to perform just to survive, just to have food to eat. And there were no paying jobs. So they were working the land, they were growing their own food, they were raising animals and livestock. The only one who had any sort of a paycheck was Karen, who started teaching the neighboring farms' children, but she wasn't even very good at that. But that was a very measly paycheck that the family had to rely on. So it was kind of a comedy of errors at times, watching the dad as the only man in the family trying to create a life for the women in his family, trying to create something that he could be proud of and that would sustain them long term, so that he could prove to his wife and his girls that he did not make an error in judgment in bringing them to this desolate farm. And he had to prove something to himself, that he was capable of supporting his family, of creating a life for them. He just wanted to be looked up to, and he wanted his wife to respect him and to look at him with agreement, with contentment. And unfortunately, that's not what happened for this family. What Johnson did was she described the land not only in its desolation, but in its beauty, the different types of trees, the different types of plants. Marget and Merle are usually the two daughters who, when they're younger, they're kind of roaming and exploring and, eating apples from trees and eating fruit from plants. And they're walking everywhere, and they're having adventures, and they're finding animals, and they're finding streams and different places that they discover abandoned things. And there are other times when they do explore neighbors' farms, when they share food back and forth. And the description that Johnson writes is so expert and masterful, it just twists my mind to realize that she was 24. And the only thing that can justify the level and the beauty of her writing is this has to be somewhat autobiographical. There's only so much I want to say about this book, because I don't want to describe a lot of the plot. There is definite plot, but the beauty of the book is its description and the beauty in the artistry in her writing. And I mean, any page that I open, and I showed this before, these are all my dog ears, and I did that because I hate the sticky tabs, but I also put arrows next to the things that I thought were so beautiful. And I wanted to read just a few of the passages. This one is midway through the book. I felt we were moving towards some awful and final thing. It would have to be the small and eternal things, the whippoorwill's long liquid howling near the cave, the shape of young mules against the ridge, moving lighter than bucks across the pasture, things like the chorus of cicadas and the ponds stained red in evenings. As long as I can see, I thought, I shall never go utterly starved or thirsty or want to die. And I thought this because I did not know, because I still had hope that Grant was not beyond me, and because I could still see him and hear him at least. I was afraid, though, and prayed, Lord, make me satisfied with small things. Make me content to live on the outside of life. God, make me love the rind. And now, there is some discussion about God and the family, that these girls that are trying to see the existence and the presence of God. But this is not a book that preaches or proselytizes to the reader. It's just part of their family life. And then a couple pages later, she writes, there must be some reason, I thought, why we should go on year after year with this lump of debt, scraling earth down to stone, giving so much and with no return. There must be some reason why I was made quiet and homely and slow, and then given this stone of love to mumble, love was a stone. Now, part of the major theme in this book is the mortgage. They land on this farm, on this land, this family land, but it's mortgaged. And in the 30s, a mortgage was almost a death sentence. And that is a common thread that runs through the novel. What the father thinks about being on mortgaged land, the fear that at any moment a banker can show up on their front porch and demand their money. We don't look at mortgages the same way. A normal person like me, we own our home and we have to take out a mortgage to be able to afford to live in our home. And so our mortgage payment every month is just something that normal people do. We pay for our home. And I don't have the same fear that at any moment the bank is going to knock on my front door. I don't have any fear that at any instant the bank is going to call in my mortgage. Yes, legally they could do that. But this was a different time, and during the Great Depression, banks were folding, banks were collapsing, and all they wanted was their money. So poor farmers like this on mortgaged land were terrified that at any moment they could lose family land that they've had for generations. And so everything occurs in this book. It starts off so optimistically and with so much happiness and hope. And by the end of the book, It's 10 years later from the beginning of the book till the end. The land is almost another character, not just in description, but the land is a character, as is the description of the landscape, as is each of the characters in this family. And we kind of go along with their journeys of starting off hopeful, looking towards the future, coming to a realization in the middle of the book of what they're actually dealing with and how they process and how they live through the very end of the book. And it's absolutely gorgeous. It's just gorgeous. And believe it or not, in the afterword, which is really interesting to read in itself, they mention Middlemarch. It says, one helpful way to situate Now in November is to categorize it as a novel of female late adolescence, of waiting, thinking, observing, anticipating, but not of action. Indeed, despite the harsh rural setting and backdrop of political violence and economic deprivation, the sisters of Now in November are not unlike Jane Austen's sisters of Pride and Prejudice, or George Eliot's Dorothea in Middlemarch, or Doris Lessing's Martha Quest in the novel of the same name. Unspoken rules and social mores shape these young female lives. These young women long for freedom to leave home, but they are forbidden to venture into the world alone. They long for sexual experience, for intimacy, but they can do nothing but be attractive, useful, and available. They are on the verge of intellectual maturity, but have only books and abstractions, not the dilemmas of the public world with which to grapple. Furthermore, they know that decisions about religion and personal philosophy belong to the men of the family, and no matter what independent ideas they developed, they will be tempered in marriage. And that kind of summarizes each of these three daughters' lives and their outlooks and what their expectations are and what their father thinks their lives and their futures should be. This is one of the most beautifully written books I've ever read. It is so underexposed and underappreciated. I'm urging anyone who has never heard of her, who has never heard of this novel, to go out and buy it. It has been reprinted and reissued as of June of 2022, this past summer. And it's in the bookstores now, so you can currently walk into a bookstore and ask for it and buy it. This is actually the British cover, so it's going to look different than this. But it has been reissued. Please consider buying it. Please consider reading it. I would love to know what you think about it if you do. I love this book so much that I went out and I found a beautiful used copy of the Franklin Library's edition of Now in November. And the Franklin Library has published Pulitzer Prize winning novels in these either leather or imitation leather volumes. And this end paper is almost like a sateen or a satin. And these particular editions, let's see, this one was published, and it has illustrations. The artwork is beautiful, and there are illustrations throughout the novel. This one was published in 1976 by the Franklin Library, and it's just in brand new condition, and I bought it used. Those are another illustration, and I had to have this on my shelf because this is a forever book. I will keep this forever. I might even continue to read it several more times. Please let me know what you think. Please let me know if you have any urge or plans or motivations to read this. I hope you do. And write me a comment down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, everybody.